A tiny voice cuts through the snowy park. "I don't have a mama. Can I spend a day with you, ma'am?" A lonely woman, a millionaire, and a child weave an unexpected bond that will melt your heart. Drop a comment with your favorite winter memory to join the magic. Rate this touching tale from 0 to 10 at the end. Dive into Yvonne, Preston, and Lila's journey. The park was a living canvas of winter, its snow-draped paths glowing under strings of fairy lights that winked like stars against the deepening dusk. Laughter and carols wove through the air, mingling with the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Yvonne Carter, a vision in her 30s, with blonde hair spilling in soft waves beneath a charcoal beret, moved through the crowd with a purpose that bordered on desperation. Her tailored wool coat, though elegant, did little to shield her from the biting cold, or the weight of her thoughts. She was late, her mind a tangle of rehearsed answers for a job interview that could change everything. The corporate world had chewed her up and spat her out too many times, and this was her last shot at stability. Her heels clicked against the icy path, each step a metronome of urgency, until a small, trembling voice sliced through the festive hum like a bell in the silence. "I don't have a mama. Can I spend a day with you, ma'am?" Yvonne froze, her breath catching in a cloud before her. She blinked, startled, and looked down. A girl, no older than 3, stood before her, a tiny figure swallowed by a faded red coat that hung loose on her frame. Blonde curls, wild and unbrushed, peeked from beneath a knit cap, and her blue eyes, wide as saucers, glistened with a hope so raw it felt like a plea. In her mittened hand, she clutched a stuffed rabbit, its ears frayed from love. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, unmoving, as if the world held its breath with her. Yvonne's first instinct was to glance around, searching for a parent, a guardian, anyone to claim this child. The park buzzed with life. Children darted past, shrieking as they slid down icy slopes. Parents tugging sleds with gloved hands. But no one seemed tethered to this girl. Then her eyes landed on a man standing a few yards away, motionless amid the flurry. His golden hair caught the lantern light, and his tailored coat, though luxurious, was dusted with snow, as if he'd been standing there for hours. His posture wasn't one of desperation, but of quiet vigilance, a sentinel watching over his charge. Their gazes met, and his eyes, deep green like pine after a storm, carried a warmth that steadied her racing pulse. There was a weariness in them, yes, but also a tenderness that seemed to wrap the little girl in an invisible embrace. Yvonne knelt, her coat brushing the snow, and met the girl's gaze. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Her voice, usually sharp from years of navigating temp jobs and dismissive hiring managers, softened in a way that surprised her. "Lila," the girl whispered, her voice barely louder than the snow's soft fall. "I just want to know what it feels like to hold a mama's hand." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Yvonne's carefully guarded heart. She swallowed, her throat tight, and glanced again at the man. He hadn't moved, but his eyes held hers, offering no demand, only patience. A silent permission to choose. Yvonne's life was a study in solitude. Her apartment, a cramped rental with peeling paint, held no photos, no traces of family. Her days were a blur of resumes, rejections, and the hollow ache of a dream deferred. She'd once imagined a different life. Love, laughter, a child's sticky fingers in hers. But those hopes had been buried under years of scraping by. Yet here was this girl, Lila, asking for something so simple, so profound, it cracked the ice around Yvonne's heart. She extended her gloved hand, hesitating only a moment. "Just for today, let's walk together." Lila's face bloomed with a smile that could have melted the snow at their feet. Her tiny fingers curled into Yvonne's, small but certain, as if they'd always belonged there. The man, Preston Langley she'd learn later, approached slowly, his boots crunching softly. Up close, his beauty was almost startling, his features chiseled, yet softened by a quiet strength. "She's not usually this bold," he said, his voice low, resonant, like a cello string plucked in the dark. But today, she needed to ask. Yvonne nodded, unsure why her chest felt so tight. "She's brave," she said, her eyes flicking to Lila, who was already tugging her toward a twinkling path. Preston's lips curved into the faintest smile, a flicker of gratitude passing through his gaze. He followed at a distance, close enough to watch, far enough to let the moment unfold. The park was alive with winter's magic. A brass band played Silent Night near the entrance, where a towering pine glittered with ornaments. Children in puffy jackets raced past, their laughter sharp against the cold. Yvonne, Lila's hand in hers, felt the world shift. Each step with this child was a step away from the weight of her failures. The job she hadn't landed, the rent she could barely pay. Lila's chatter filled the silence, her voice a bright thread weaving through the dusk. "Do you like snow? I like snow. It's like stars you can touch." Yvonne laughed, a sound she barely recognized. "I do like snow," she said, surprising herself with the truth. They paused at a vendor's cart, where the scent of hot chocolate mingled with the crisp air. Yvonne handed over a crumpled bill, her last, she realized with a pang, and bought Lila a tiny snow globe. Inside, a miniature village glowed under a swirl of glitter. Lila clutched it to her chest, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's magic," she whispered. Preston watched from the edge of the path, his hands in his pockets, his breath forming soft clouds. When Lila turned to wave at him, he returned a quiet nod, his eyes never leaving her. Yvonne caught his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the fragility of this moment. She was a stranger, yet Lila's hand in hers felt like a promise she hadn't known she'd made. They stopped by a massive Christmas tree, its lights dancing like fireflies. Lila pointed to a silver bell ornament, her mittens flapping. "Can I touch it?" Yvonne lifted her, her arms steady despite the ache in her chest. As Lila's fingers brushed the bell, Yvonne felt a warmth she couldn't name. For the first time in years, she wasn't running, not from her past, not toward an uncertain future. She was here, in this park, with a child who'd chosen her and a man whose quiet presence felt like an anchor. Preston joined them, his voice soft. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes on Lila. Yvonne nodded, her throat too full for words. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing the world in silence. As they stood together, an unlikely trio bound by a child's wish, the park's lights seemed to glow brighter, as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep this moment alive. Yvonne didn't know what tomorrow held. Another rejection, another bill. But for now, she held Lila's hand, and it was enough. The snow fell heavier now, cloaking the park in a hush that felt like a secret shared only by those who lingered. Yvonne Carter, her gloved hand still wrapped around Lila's tiny one, felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. The little girl's touch was a tether, grounding her in a way that no job interview or fleeting hope of stability ever had. Lila's bright chatter about snowflakes and stars filled the air, her red coat a vivid splash against the white canvas of winter. Preston Langley followed a few steps behind, his presence steady as a lighthouse in a storm, his green eyes tracking Lila with a tenderness that made Yvonne's chest ache. The Christmas tree's golden lights cast long shadows, and as they moved deeper into the park's festive heart, Yvonne felt a daring impulse rise within her. "Let's walk a bit more," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended, almost lost in the carols drifting from the bandstand. Lila's face lit up, her curls bouncing as she nodded vigorously. "Can we see the ice skaters?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Yvonne glanced at Preston, seeking his silent approval. He gave a small nod, his lips curving into a smile that carried both gratitude and caution, as if he, too, sensed the fragility of this unexpected connection. The trio wove through the crowd, past children shrieking with delight as they sledded down a nearby hill. The air was sharp with pine and the sweet tang of mulled wine from a vendor's stall. Yvonne, usually a solitary figure darting through life's demands, felt the world slow. Lila's hand in hers was a small, warm miracle, and Preston's quiet steps behind them were a rhythm she hadn't realized she'd been missing. They reached the skating rink, a glittering oval where couples and families glided under strings of twinkling lights. Lila pressed her face to the wooden railing, her breath fogging the air. "They're dancing on ice," she squealed, clapping her mittens. Yvonne laughed, a sound that felt foreign, yet freeing. "Would you like some hot chocolate to warm up?" she asked, gesturing to a cart nearby, its steam curling into the cold. Lila nodded eagerly, and Yvonne handed over another crumpled bill, wincing inwardly at her dwindling funds. The vendor, a grizzled man with a kind smile, handed Lila a steaming cup topped with a swirl of whipped cream. "Sprinkles, please," Lila chirped, and the vendor obliged, dusting the drink with rainbow flecks. Yvonne's heart tugged at the sight of Lila's delight, her small tongue darting out to catch the cream. Preston stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, watching Lila with an intensity that spoke of a love too deep for words. Yvonne caught his eye, and for a moment the world narrowed to just them, their shared gaze a bridge across the chasm of their different lives. Preston was a man who lived in penthouses, his days filled with boardrooms and sterile accolades. Yet here he was, tethered to a child who wasn't his by blood. Yvonne, scraping by in a world that had rejected her ambition, felt a kinship in his quiet strength, a mirror to her resilience. "Let's take a picture," Yvonne suggested, pulling out her cracked phone. She knelt beside Lila, their cheeks pressed close, the skating rink's lights sparkling behind them. Lila giggled, her whipped cream mustache smudging Yvonne's coat. Preston hesitated, then crouched beside them, his shoulder brushing Yvonne's. The selfie captured them mid-laugh, a frozen moment of joy that felt like a theft from time itself. Yvonne's screen glowed with the image, and she stared at it, her throat tight. When was the last time she'd smiled like that? They wandered on, stopping at a stall selling trinkets. Yvonne's eyes fell on a small snow globe, its tiny village nestled under a dome of glass. "Look, Lila," she said, shaking it gently. Glitter swirled like a storm, catching the light. Lila's gasp was pure wonder. "It's a tiny world," she exclaimed, clutching her rabbit tighter. Yvonne handed over her last few dollars, ignoring the pang in her chest. "It's yours," she said, placing it in Lila's hands. The girl held it like a treasure, her eyes reflecting the swirling flakes. Preston watched, his expression unreadable but soft. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Yvonne pause. "I wanted to," she replied, meeting his gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement of her choice. He nodded, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the risk they were both taking by letting this moment grow. The park's energy pulsed around them, families bustling, a brass band striking up jingle bells. Lila tugged Yvonne toward a snowman, its scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Can we build one?" she asked, her voice bright with possibility. Yvonne hesitated. Her interview loomed, her future hung by a thread. But Lila's hope was a force she couldn't resist. They knelt together, packing snow into clumsy shapes, Lila's laughter ringing like bells. Preston joined them, his hands deftly shaping a lopsided head. "Not bad for a city boy," Yvonne teased, and his low chuckle warmed the air. As they worked, Yvonne stole glances at Preston. His wealth was evident in the cut of his coat, the quiet confidence of his movements. Yet he carried none of the arrogance she'd expected from a man of his stature. His focus was on Lila, his hands gentle as he adjusted her scarf, his eyes never straying far. Yvonne wondered about the life that had led him here, to a child who called him Papa, yet shared none of his blood. Her own life, endless job applications, a barren apartment, felt like a shadow compared to this moment. Yet it was here, in the snow, that she felt most alive. The snowman complete, Lila clapped, naming it Mr. Fluffy. Yvonne stepped back, her hands cold, but her heart warm. Preston stood beside her, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer now, almost raw, "for giving her this." Yvonne nodded, unable to speak. The park's lights seemed to glow brighter, as if conspiring to hold them in this fragile, perfect moment. Lila ran ahead, chasing a stray snowflake, and Yvonne and Preston followed, their steps synchronized. The distance between them, her struggles, his wealth, felt smaller with each crunch of snow underfoot. Yvonne didn't know what lay ahead, but as Lila's laughter echoed back, she felt a spark ignite, a promise that this day, this unlikely trio, was only the beginning. The park's glow lingered in Yvonne Carter's mind, like a half-remembered dream as she stood at her apartment door, key trembling in her hand. Days had passed since that snowy evening with Lila and Preston, and the memory of Lila's tiny hand in hers, of Preston's quiet nod, clung to her like the scent of pine. She'd missed her job interview, her phone silent with no follow-up, yet the ache of that failure paled against the warmth of that unexpected day. Now, standing in her cramped hallway, she made a choice that felt both reckless and right. She texted Preston, "Would you and Lila like to come over tomorrow?" His reply came swiftly, "She'd love that, so would I." The next afternoon, Yvonne's apartment, a modest space with peeling paint and a sagging couch, buzzed with nervous energy. She'd scrubbed every surface, the scent of lemon cleaner mingling with the warm cinnamon wafting from a tray of cookies, baking in her ancient oven. The doorbell chimed and her heart leapt. Lila burst in first, her blonde curls bouncing under a new knit cap, her red coat dusted with fresh snow. "It smells yummy," she squealed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Preston followed, his tailored coat incongruous against the chipped doorframe, his green eyes scanning the room with a curiosity that held no judgment. "Welcome," Yvonne said, her voice catching as she gestured to the small living room. Lila darted to the kitchen counter, where a bowl of cookie dough waited. "Can I help?" she asked, her eyes wide with delight. Yvonne laughed, tying a too large apron around Lila's waist. "You're the assistant baker today," Lila clapped, flour puffing around her like a tiny snowstorm. Preston hesitated at the threshold, his hands in his pockets, as if unsure of his place in this humble space. Yvonne caught his gaze and handed him a plain white mug of coffee, brewed from the last of her generic grounds. "I hope this is okay," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "Perfect," Preston replied, his voice low and genuine. He took the mug, his fingers brushing hers, and settled onto a worn bar stool, watching Lila with a tenderness that made Yvonne's chest tighten. The kitchen filled with Lila's chatter, stories of her rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, and a dragon toy Preston had carved. Yvonne knelt beside her, guiding her small hands to scoop dough onto the tray. Flour dusted Lila's nose, and her giggle rang out, sharp and bright, cutting through the quiet fears Yvonne carried about her empty bank account and uncertain future. As the cookies baked, Yvonne led Lila to a corner of the living room where she'd set out old sketch pads and crayons. Lila sprawled on the rug, drawing wobbly stars and hearts, her tongue poking out in concentration. Preston joined them, his presence filling the small space without overwhelming it. "You draw too?" he asked, noticing Yvonne's hesitant sketches. A half-formed tree, a swirl of snow. She flushed, shaking her head. "Not since I was a kid. I used to dream of art school, but life had other plans." Preston nodded, his eyes tracing her face. "I carve wood," he offered, almost shyly. "Toys for Lila, mostly. A rocking horse, a dragon. It's nothing grand, just keeps my hands busy." Yvonne smiled, picturing his elegant hands, shaping something so simple yet full of love. "That's more than most can say," she replied, and their eyes held for a moment, a silent bridge forming between her struggles and his hidden depths. The oven dinged, and Lila squealed, racing back to the kitchen. Yvonne pulled out the cookies, golden and fragrant, and Lila insisted on decorating them with sprinkles, her small fingers scattering color like confetti. Preston laughed, a low, warm sound that seemed to soften the room's edges, and helped Lila place a misshapen star on a cookie. Yvonne watched them, her heart a tangle of wonder and fear. This warmth, this ease, felt like a gift she didn't deserve, not when her life was a patchwork of temp jobs and unpaid bills. As the afternoon faded, Lila yawned, curling onto the couch with Mr. Whiskers and a new teddy bear Yvonne had found in a thrift shop bin. Her blonde curls fanned across the cushion, her breathing soft and even. Yvonne draped a blanket over her, her fingers lingering on the girl's cheek. Preston stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the snowy dusk outside. "She's never fallen asleep anywhere but home," he said quietly, his voice thick with something unspoken. Yvonne joined him, the room's warmth wrapping around them like a cocoon. "She feels safe here," she said, her words careful, as if testing the weight of this new reality. Preston turned, his green eyes searching hers. "You've given her something I can't," he said, his tone raw. A softness, a warmth. Yvonne's throat tightened. She wanted to ask about Lila's mother, about the life that had led him to raise a child alone, but the moment felt too fragile for questions. Instead, she gestured to the sketchpad, where Lila's stars glowed in crayon. "She's a light, isn't she?" Preston nodded, his gaze softening. "She's everything." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Yvonne felt a pull, a longing to be part of this light, yet fear whispered that she was an intruder in a story not hers. Her apartment, with its cracked walls and second-hand furniture, was no match for Preston's world of penthouses and power. Yet here he was, sipping her cheap coffee, watching Lila with a devotion that made her heart ache. The snow outside fell thicker, muffling the world beyond. Yvonne poured more coffee, her hands steady, despite the storm of emotions within. "Come back soon," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Preston's smile was small, but real. "We will." As he gathered Lila's things, his movements gentle not to wake her, Yvonne felt the spark from the park grow into something warmer, something that smelled of cinnamon and promised more than one stolen day. The scent of cinnamon lingered in Yvonne Carter's apartment long after Lila and Preston had left, a ghost of the warmth that had filled the space hours earlier. The cracked walls seemed to hold echoes of Lila's laughter, her crayon stars still scattered across the sketchpad on the rug. Yvonne stood by the window, her reflection faint against the snowy night, her fingers tracing the rim of the empty coffee mug Preston had held. The invitation to return, so casually offered, felt like a thread stretched taut between her heart and something she dared not name. Her life, a patchwork of temp jobs, unpaid bills, and a solitude she'd worn like armor, had cracked open, and the vulnerability scared her as much as it thrilled her. Weeks passed, and the visits became a rhythm, as natural as the snow that continued to fall. Lila's presence transformed Yvonne's apartment into a haven of small joys. Cookie crumbs on the counter, a teddy bear forgotten on the couch, a child's drawings taped to the fridge. Preston, too, became a fixture. His tailored coats hung on a rickety hook by the door, his quiet strength filling the gaps Yvonne hadn't realized were there. One evening, as winter tightened its grip, the three of them sat in the glow of a single lamp. Lila, asleep on the couch, her blonde curls fanned across a thrift shop blanket. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the radiator and the distant howl of the wind outside. Yvonne poured coffee, still the generic kind, though she'd splurged on a slightly better brand, and handed Preston a mug. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, its surface scarred from years of use. The stove's warmth made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if the world beyond had faded away. Preston's fingers wrapped around the mug, his gaze distant, fixed on Lila's sleeping form. "She's never this peaceful anywhere else," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. "You've given her something I can't explain." Yvonne's heart stuttered, but she kept her eyes on her mug, the steam curling like a question. "She's easy to love," she said softly, the words feeling both true and dangerous. Preston nodded, but his silence carried a weight, an invitation to something deeper. Yvonne felt it, the pull to ask, to know the man behind the quiet strength, the millionaire who carved wooden toys and raised a child not his own. But fear held her back, a fear of breaking the fragile balance they'd found. Preston spoke first, his voice steady, but thick with memory. "I found her on my doorstep, you know. Barely a week old, wrapped in a blanket with a bear stitched on it. No name, no note, just a scrap of paper that said, 'Please don't hate her.' I didn't know how to hold a baby, let alone raise one." He paused, his eyes tracing the lines of the table. But her eyes, blue, unblinking, looked at me like she knew I wouldn't walk away. So I didn't. Yvonne's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her mug. The image of Preston, a man whose life was measured in boardroom victories and stock market gains, standing frozen before an abandoned infant, cracked something open in her. She wanted to speak, to fill the silence, but her scars pressed against her ribs, demanding their turn. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I was 27, I thought I'd be a mother." Preston looked up, his green eyes steady, inviting her to continue. The words came slowly, each one a stone lifted from a buried place. "I was in love, or I thought I was. He was charming, said all the right things about a future together. We heard the heartbeat at 12 weeks. I'd never felt joy like that." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "At 16 weeks, something went wrong. The emergency room was a blur of cold hands and sterile lights. The doctor's eyes were kind when he told me it might be nearly impossible to carry again." The room was still, the radiator's hum the only sound. Preston said nothing, his silence a space for her to breathe. Yvonne's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tracing the mug's chipped edge. "He left soon after. Said it was too much, that I needed to heal. What he meant was he didn't want me if I couldn't give him a child." A humorless laugh escaped her. "I didn't cry, not then, not ever. Yvonne Carter doesn't cry, not in hospitals, not in job interviews, not in the dark." Preston's eyes held hers, not with pity, but with a quiet understanding that felt like a hand extended across a chasm. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. "Not because you don't cry, but because you're still here, giving her." He nodded toward Lila, a place to feel safe. Yvonne's throat tightened, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She wanted to argue, to say she was no hero, just a woman scraping by. But Preston's gaze stopped her. It saw her, not the polished facade she'd worn to survive, but the raw, aching parts she'd hidden for years. The silence between them was deep, not uncomfortable but sacred, like two people bearing their scars under the soft glow of a single lamp. Outside, the snow fell thick, muffling the world in a blanket of stillness. Yvonne stood, busying herself with rinsing the mugs, her hands trembling. Preston rose too, stepping to the counter, his presence steady, but not intrusive. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. He didn't reach for her, didn't press, but his nearness was enough to make her feel less like a shadow in her own life. Lila stirred on the couch, murmuring softly, and Yvonne moved to her, tucking the blanket closer. Preston watched, his expression unreadable but soft. "She's changing me," Yvonne admitted, her voice barely audible. "I didn't expect that." Preston's smile was small, almost shy. "She does that. Changed me too." As he gathered Lila's things, preparing to leave, Yvonne felt a shift, subtle but undeniable. The apartment, once a hollow shell, now held traces of something real: cookie crumbs, a child's drawing, the echo of shared truths. Preston lifted Lila gently, her head resting against his shoulder, and paused at the door. "We'll come back," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "If that's okay." Yvonne nodded, her heart too full for words. As the door closed behind them, the snow outside seemed to whisper a promise, one that carried the warmth of cinnamon and the weight of scars shared in the quiet. For the first time in years, Yvonne didn't feel like she had to be unbreakable. She just had to be here, in this moment, waiting for the next. Spring crept into the city, softening the snow into slush and coaxing tentative buds from bare branches. Yvonne Carter's apartment, once a stark refuge of solitude, now hummed with the remnants of winter's warmth. Lila's crayon drawings taped to the fridge, a half-eaten cookie on the counter, the faint scent of cinnamon lingering like a promise kept. The visits from Lila and Preston had woven a delicate rhythm into her days, each one a stitch in a tapestry she hadn't dared imagine. Yet, as the seasons shifted, so did the weight in Yvonne's chest, a quiet fear that this fragile joy was borrowed, not hers to keep. Her life, still a precarious dance of job applications and dwindling savings, felt like a shadow cast over the light Lila brought. On a bright Saturday, Yvonne and Lila sprawled on a grassy hillside in the same park where they'd met, the air now warm with the scent of earth and blooming daisies. The festive lights were gone, replaced by kites dotting the sky, but the park still held a magic that made Lila's eyes sparkle. She sat cross-legged, her blonde curls catching the sunlight, weaving a daisy chain with fierce concentration. Yvonne, in a simple sweater and jeans, helped her thread the stems, her laughter mingling with Lila's giggles as petals stuck to their fingers. The moment was soft, unguarded, a bubble of peace Yvonne wanted to hold forever. Preston had stayed behind, working on a bookshelf repair at his city penthouse, a rare absence that left Yvonne and Lila alone. The freedom of it was exhilarating, but it also sharpened the edges of Yvonne's thoughts. She'd grown used to Preston's quiet presence, his green eyes that saw her without judgment, his hands that carved toys with a tenderness that mirrored his care for Lila. But today, it was just her and Lila, and the weight of that trust pressed against her heart. Lila hummed a tuneless song, her small hands deftly looping daisies. "Mama Yvonne," she said suddenly, her voice clear and bright, "if I have you, do I still need Papa?" The world stopped. Yvonne's breath caught, her fingers freezing mid-knot. The hillside, the kites, the distant laughter of other children, all faded into a ringing silence. Lila's blue eyes, wide and honest, held no malice, only curiosity. But the question was a blade, slicing through the fragile bond Yvonne had built. Her heart thudded, too loud, too fast, as she stared at the child who'd become her son. "Your Papa is your home, sweetheart," she managed, her voice steady despite the storm within. "Always," Lila nodded, satisfied, and returned to her daisies, plucking petals with a contented hum. But Yvonne couldn't move. Her body locked in place, as if the ground had turned to ice. The words echoed, relentless. Mama Yvonne. They were a gift, a title she'd never dared claim, yet they carried a weight that threatened to crush her. Was she stealing something from Preston? Something sacred? The thought clawed at her, sharp and cold. She'd lost a child once, a heartbeat silenced at 16 weeks, and with it, the man who'd promised her forever. She'd rebuilt herself, piece by jagged piece. But this, Lila's love, Preston's trust, felt like a dream she had no right to dream. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Yvonne smiled, helped Lila finish her daisy crown, and laughed when the girl placed it lopsidedly on her head. But the joy felt brittle, like glass ready to shatter. When Preston arrived to pick Lila up, his smile warm as he knelt to admire her handiwork, Yvonne's heart ached with a guilt she couldn't name. She waved them off, her apartment door closing with a soft click that sounded final. That night, she sat on her couch, the sketchpad of Lila's stars untouched, her phone silent. The warmth of their visits felt like a theft now, a trespass into a life not hers. Days turned to weeks, and Yvonne withdrew. Her texts to Preston grew sparse, her excuses vague. A job interview, a headache, a need for space. The truth was heavier. She was terrified. Terrified of loving Lila too much, of wanting Preston in ways she hadn't allowed herself to want anyone since her heart broke years ago. Her apartment, once alive with Lila's laughter, grew quiet again, the silence a mirror to the one she'd lived with for so long. She applied for jobs, sat through interviews, but her mind drifted to Lila's curls, to Preston's quiet strength, and the question that haunted her. Was she taking too much? Preston felt the shift immediately. He didn't push, didn't question, but his texts grew shorter, his tone careful. For Lila's sake, he poured himself into being enough, cooking her favorite soups, carving a wooden bunny that made her squeal, reading extra bedtime stories until his voice grew hoarse. But at night, when Lila slept, he sat at his sleek kitchen counter, a world away from Yvonne's chipped table, and wondered where he'd gone wrong. Lila's questions about Mama Yvonne came daily, her small voice hopeful. "Is she coming today?" Preston would brush her curls back, his smile steady. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart." But the tomorrows stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Yvonne, alone in her apartment, gripped her phone, Preston's last message unanswered. "Lila misses you." She wanted to reply, to run back to them, but fear held her fast. What if her love for Lila was a thief, stealing the bond she shared with Preston? What if her growing feelings for him, unspoken, untested, were a betrayal of the life he'd built for his daughter? She'd survived loss before, but this felt different, like losing something she'd only just found. The daisies Lila had woven sat wilted on her table, their petals curling like a warning. Outside, the city bloomed with spring, but Yvonne's world felt frozen, caught in the echo of a child's question. She didn't know how to move forward, but the silence was a weight she couldn't bear much longer. Somewhere, in the space between her fear and her longing, a truth waited, one that would demand she choose between running from love or stepping into its uncertain light. The city had traded spring's tentative bloom for the raw bite of early winter, a chill that seeped through Yvonne Carter's apartment walls and settled into her bones. The silence she'd chosen, weeks of unanswered texts, of avoiding Preston and Lila, had rebuilt the armor she'd worn for years, but it was a hollow victory. Her apartment, once vibrant with Lila's laughter and the scent of cinnamon, now echoed with the hum of a lonely radiator and the weight of her own guilt. Lila's question, "If I have you, do I still need Papa?" haunted her, a splinter lodged in her heart. Yvonne had withdrawn to protect them, to keep from stealing a role she felt unworthy of. But the absence of their warmth left her colder than the snow piling outside her window. Across town, Preston Langley sat at his sleek kitchen counter, the city's skyline glittering beyond his penthouse glass. Lila slept in her room, her wooden bunny clutched tight. But her questions about Mama Yvonne had grown quieter, tinged with a confusion that broke Preston's heart. He'd kept up the routines, soups simmered, stories read, toys carved, but the spark from their park days had dimmed. He wondered if he'd misread Yvonne, if her retreat was a rejection not just of him, but of the fragile family they'd begun to weave. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, soft and scarred, in that cinnamon-scented kitchen. The storm came without warning, a blizzard that turned the city into a maze of white. Lila woke with a cough, a dry rasp that Preston dismissed as a cold until her forehead burned under his hand. By evening, her small body was limp, her cheeks flushed with a fever that refused to break. Panic clawed at him, sharp and unfamiliar. He bundled her in every warm layer they owned, her red coat, a scarf, his own wool hat, and carried her through the blinding snow, the urgent care center a beacon in the dark. The streets were empty, the wind howling like a warning, but Preston's focus was singular. Lila, her breathing shallow, her weight a fragile anchor in his arms. The waiting room was sterile, its fluorescent lights harsh against the night. A nurse, her face kind but brisk, rushed them to an exam room. Lila whimpered, her blue eyes half open, and Preston's hands shook as he held her, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You're okay, sweetheart. Papa's here." The doctor administered medication, but hours later, the fever clung stubbornly, Lila's skin clammy, her sleep restless. Preston sat by her bed, his tailored coat discarded, his tie loosened, his world narrowed to the rise and fall of her chest. He'd faced boardroom battles, market crashes, but nothing had prepared him for this helplessness. His phone sat heavy in his hand, Yvonne's name glowing on the screen. He'd hesitated for weeks, respecting her silence. But now, with Lila's fever unyielding, his fear overrode his restraint. He pressed call, the ring, sharp in the quiet room. It barely sounded once before Yvonne answered, her voice breathless, urgent. "Preston? What's wrong?" "She's sick," he said, his voice breaking. "Her fever won't go down. I didn't know who else to call." The words were a confession, a bridge across the weeks of distance. Yvonne didn't hesitate. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, the hospital door swung open, and Yvonne stepped in, her coat dusted with snow, her blonde hair tangled from the wind. She didn't speak, didn't pause, just crossed the room and knelt by Lila's bedside, her hand finding the girl's clammy fingers. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to Lila's forehead. "I'm here." Lila stirred, her eyes fluttering, and a small sigh escaped her, as if Yvonne's presence alone was medicine. Preston stood a few steps away, his chest tight with relief and something deeper, gratitude, raw and unguarded. He hadn't seen Yvonne in weeks, yet here she was, her face etched with worry, her hands steady as she smoothed Lila's curls. The hospital room, with its beeping monitors and sterile walls, felt less cold with her there. Yvonne hummed a lullaby, soft and halting, her voice a thread of calm in the storm. Preston watched, his heart a tangle of fear and hope, as Lila's breathing eased, her small body curling toward Yvonne's warmth. Hours passed, the blizzard raging outside, but inside, time slowed. Yvonne refused to leave, her eyes never straying far from Lila. She adjusted the cloth, whispered comforts, and when Lila whimpered, she stroked her hand, her touch a quiet promise. Preston sat beside them, his exhaustion mirrored in Yvonne's face, but neither spoke of it. The silence wasn't heavy now. It was shared, a space where their fears for Lila bound them closer than words could. As dawn broke, gray light filtering through the window, Lila's fever finally eased. She slept deeply, her face peaceful, nestled in Yvonne's lap. Preston's shoulders sagged, the weight of the night lifting but leaving him raw. He looked at Yvonne, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, and spoke, his voice rough. "I was afraid she'd love you more." The confession hung in the air, fragile and true. "But now, I see it. She needs us both." Yvonne's breath caught, her hand stilling on Lila's curls. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and saw no blame, only a quiet acceptance that mirrored her own longing. She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, warm and certain. The touch said what words couldn't, a vow to stay, to face this together. Preston's grip tightened, his thumb brushing her knuckles, and in that moment, the weeks of silence dissolved, replaced by a fragile hope. The hospital's hum faded, the world outside still buried in snow. Lila stirred, her eyes opening briefly, a faint smile crossing her lips as she saw Yvonne and Preston together. Yvonne leaned down, kissing her forehead, and Preston's hand stayed in hers, an anchor in the quiet. Something had healed. Not everything, not yet, but enough to carry them forward. As the storm outside began to still, Yvonne felt the spark from that first snowy day flare into something stronger, a flame that could warm the coldest nights. The hospital room's sterile hum had faded into memory, but the warmth of Yvonne Carter's hand in Preston Langley's lingered, a quiet vow sealed in the blizzard's aftermath. A year had passed since Lila's fever had drawn them back together, and the world had shifted beneath their feet. The city's skyline, once a glittering cage for Preston's ambition, was now a distant silhouette. They had traded his glass-walled penthouse for a log cabin nestled at the forest's edge, its wooden beams creaking with the weight of new beginnings. The air was crisp with pine, the chimney puffing smoke into a sky dusted with early winter snow. Yvonne, once adrift in a sea of rejections, now stood in the cabin's kitchen, her blonde hair tied in a messy bun, flour dusting her cheek as she stirred a pot of stew. The scent of cinnamon wove through the air, a thread connecting this new life to the one that began in a snowy park. Preston worked beside her, his hands steady as he carved a miniature rocking horse, its curves smooth under his knife. The toy was for a boy at the shelter, part of their nonprofit. One warm day, born from that first day with Lila, the foundation had grown roots, providing meals, toys, and hope to single parents and children. Its name a tribute to the moment a child's wish rewove their futures. Lila, now 4, burst into the kitchen, her blonde curls sparkling with glitter, a crayon, drawing flapping in her hand like a flag. "Mama, Papa, look!" she squealed, thrusting the paper forward. "It's our house with stars on the roof. That means it's magic." Yvonne knelt, her laughter bright as she pulled Lila close. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "You're right. It is magic." Preston leaned in, brushing a speck of glitter from Lila's nose with a chuckle. "Our best artist yet," he said, his green eyes warm with a love that had deepened through months of quiet moments. Their rhythm was effortless now, a dance of shared glances and unspoken trust. Yvonne, no longer chasing dead-end jobs, had found purpose in their work, her hands kneading dough as naturally as they once typed resumes. Preston, his wealth now a tool for good, carved toys and futures with equal care, his heart anchored in this cabin. The cabin itself was a testament to their choice, a modest space with creaking floors, hand-carved furniture, and shelves overflowing with Lila's drawings. No marble counters or golden handles, just the warmth of a home built on love. Lila's laughter echoed off the walls, her handmade backpack slung over a chair, ready for preschool. Each morning, she marched off, proudly telling her teachers, "Mama reads fairy tales, And Papa makes toys. Yvonne and Preston would watch her go, their hands brushing as they stood on the porch, the old pickup truck rumbling faithfully behind them. This evening, as the stew simmered, Yvonne felt a contentment she'd never known. The cabin was alive with small joys, Lila's chatter, the crackle of the fireplace, the soft scrape of Preston's knife. Yet beneath it, a quiet tension stirred. Their love had grown in stolen moments, shared coffee, late-night talks, the brush of hands over dishes, but they hadn't spoken of forever. Yvonne glanced at Preston, his focus on the rocking horse, and wondered if he felt the same unspoken question. Could this last? Lila, oblivious to the undercurrent, tugged Yvonne's sleeve. "Can we read about the princess tonight?" Yvonne smiled, lifting her onto the counter. "Cinderella or Rapunzel?" Lila's eyes widened. "The match girl. But make it happy." Yvonne's heart tugged, remembering Lila's solemn love for the tale. "We'll make it warm, okay?" she promised, kissing her forehead. Preston watched, his knife pausing, a storm of emotions flickering in his gaze. He'd once been Lila's only storyteller, but now Yvonne shared that role, her voice weaving magic into their nights. As Lila scampered off to fetch her book, Preston set the carving aside, his hands stilling. "You've changed her," he said quietly, his voice rough with gratitude. "She's brighter, bolder." Yvonne flushed, her hands pausing in the stew. "She's changed me," she admitted, her voice soft. "I didn't know I could feel this whole." Preston's smile was small but real, a bridge across the space between them. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm, and for a moment, the cabin's warmth felt infinite. Dinner was simple. Stew, bread, Lila's chatter filling the gaps. Afterward, they curled up by the fireplace. Lila nestled between them as Yvonne read, her voice softening the matchgirl's tale into one of hope. Lila's eyes drooped, her head resting on Yvonne's lap, and Preston's arm brushed hers, a silent anchor. The fire's glow painted the room in gold, and Yvonne felt a peace she'd never known. Yet the question of forever lingered, unspoken but heavy. As Lila slept, Preston stood, stepping onto the porch. Yvonne followed, the night air sharp with pine. Snowflakes drifted down, catching in her hair. "Still adjusting to this life?" Preston asked, his voice low, amused. Yvonne smiled, pulling her sweater tighter. "I've burned bread, ruined a birdhouse, and gotten glue in my hair, but I've never been happier," he laughed, a sound that warmed her more than the fire. Then, his expression softened, his hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, its cherry wood surface smooth from his hands. Yvonne's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a carved ring, simple yet perfect, nestled in dark velvet. "You're not the miracle I asked for," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you're the one I needed. Will you be my wife?" Yvonne's heart stopped, then surged. She dropped to her knees in the snow beside him, her laughter mingling with tears. "Yes," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. "Let's build this, our life." Inside, Lila peeked through the frosted window, her squeal breaking the night. "Mama said yes." The cabin glowed brighter, as if the love within spilled out, a starlit promise in the snow. The snow fell in a delicate curtain, each flake a silent blessing on the log cabin where Yvonne Carter Preston and Preston Langley had carved their new life. The night of Preston's proposal, with its cherrywood ring and Lila's gleeful squeal, had sealed a promise that glowed brighter than the stars on their daughter's crayon-drawn roof. A year later, on Christmas Eve, the cabin stood as a beacon of warmth, its windows aglow with amber light, the scent of pine and cinnamon curling through the air. Yvonne, her blonde hair loose and dusted with snow, stood in the kitchen, her hands shaping dough for tomorrow's bread. The ring on her finger, worn smooth by daily tasks, caught the light, a quiet testament to the life they'd built. Preston, beside her, sanded a wooden toy, a tiny boat for a shelter child, his green eyes soft as he stole glances at his wife. Lila, now 4.5, danced through the room, her curls sparkling with glitter, clutching a drawing of their family under a starry sky. Their marriage, consecrated in a simple ceremony under falling snow, had deepened their bond, a rhythm of shared mornings and late-night whispers. One warm day, their nonprofit had flourished, its roots spreading through the community, offering meals, toys, and hope to single parents and children. The cabin, with its creaking floors and hand-carved shelves, was a far cry from Preston's former penthouse, but it held a richness no wealth could buy. Lila's laughter, the crackle of the fireplace, the quiet joy of a family chosen, not born. Tonight, the air buzzed with anticipation. Yvonne glanced at Preston, a smile tugging at her lips. "Ready for our tradition?" she asked, her voice warm. Preston nodded, setting the toy aside. "Wouldn't miss it," Lila clapped, sensing the plan. The park, she squealed, tugging at Yvonne's sleeve. They bundled up, Lila in a new red coat, Yvonne in wool and a scarf. Lila had decorated with glitter glue, Preston with a thermos of hot cocoa steaming in his hands. The old pickup truck rumbled to life, carrying them through the snowy lanes to the park where it all began. The town square was alive with holiday magic, its towering Christmas tree draped in lights that danced like fireflies. Families bustled, children darted through the snow, and a brass band played Silent Night, its notes weaving through the crisp air. Yvonne's heart swelled as they stepped onto the familiar path, Lila's hand in hers, Preston's arm brushing her shoulder. The park held their history, the bench where Lila's tiny voice had first pierced Yvonne's solitude, the rink where they'd laughed over hot chocolate, the tree where a selfie had captured their first spark. Now, they were no longer strangers on the outside looking in. They were whole, a family bound by choice. Lila tugged them toward the tree, her boots crunching in the snow. "Can we touch the bell again?" she asked, her blue eyes bright. Yvonne lifted her, her arms strong now from carrying Lila through countless moments, and Lila's fingers brushed a silver bell ornament, its chime soft but clear. Preston stood close, his thermos warming their hands as they shared cocoa, its steam curling into the night. Yvonne caught his gaze, and the love there, steady, unspoken, made her breath catch. She'd once feared this life was a dream too fragile to hold, but here, under the tree's glow, it was real. Lila, nestled between them, looked up, her face solemn. "Can we be together forever?" she asked, her voice small but piercing, echoing the question that had started it all. Yvonne's heart stopped, memories flooding back. Lila's plea in the snow, the hospital's quiet vigil, the ring carved from Preston's heart. She knelt, her eyes level with Lila's, and Preston joined her, their hands tightening around the girl's. "Forever and ever," they said in unison, their voices a vow that rang truer than any wedding bell. Lila's face lit up, and she threw her arms around their legs, her coat rustling. "I don't have a mama," she said, then paused, her smile radiant. "But I have Mama Yvonne, and it's forever." Yvonne's eyes burned, tears spilling as she pulled Lila close, her cheek pressed to the girl's curls. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Forever." Preston's hand found hers, his grip warm and certain, and they stood, a trio unbreakable against the winter's chill. The crowd around them faded, the band's music a distant hum. Snow fell gently, catching in Lila's lashes, dusting Preston's hair, settling on Yvonne's scarf. They walked slowly past the bench, where Yvonne had once sat alone, its wooden slats now covered in a fresh layer of white. Lila skipped ahead, chasing a snowflake, and Yvonne leaned into Preston, her head resting on his shoulder. "We made it," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold. He kissed her temple, his voice low. "We're just getting started." The park's lights seemed to pulse, as if the universe itself celebrated their bond. They stopped by a vendor, buying Lila a tiny snow globe, its village swirling with glitter, a twin to the one Yvonne had given her that first day. Lila clutched it, her eyes wide with wonder, and Yvonne felt time fold, past and present merging in the girl's smile. The weight of her old life, rejections, loss, solitude, had no hold here. Not when Lila called her mama, not when Preston's love was her anchor. As they headed back to the truck, Lila riding on Preston's shoulders, Yvonne glanced at the sky, stars peeking through the snow. She'd once thought love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a dream stolen by a cold hospital room and a man who walked away. But here, in this park, with a child who chose her and a man who stayed, she'd found it, carved from moments as fleeting and eternal as snowflakes. The truck's engine roared, carrying them home to their cabin where the fire waited and the future stretched like an open road. Under the starlit snow, their love was a quiet miracle, not perfect but theirs, a promise kept in the heart of winter. If Yvonne, Preston, and Lila's journey warmed your heart or brought a tear to your eye, share your thoughts below. Did their story spark a memory of your own found family or winter magic? Rate this tale from 0 to 10 and let us know what moved you most. Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt adventure. We'll see you in the next story, where love and hope weave new miracles.